In August 1943, 18,000 feet over the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Richard Bong watched as his wingman's P-38 Lightning spiraled into the Pacific. 3 Japanese Zeros had ambushed them from above, and now Bong was alone with the lead Zero closing in fast. He performed a textbook defensive maneuver, a hard right bank with full throttle, attempting to climb away from the threat. But the Zero turned tighter, getting into firing position, and Bong had maybe 4 seconds before 20mm cannon fire would tear through his aircraft. What happened next wasn't in any manual. Bong rolled his P-38 completely inverted and yanked the stick forward. Instead of climbing away, he dove straight toward the ocean. Blood rushed to his head and his vision blurred. For 2 critical seconds, his instruments were unreadable. When he rolled level again at 12,000 feet, the Zero was above him, overshooting and out of position. Bong had survived, stumbling onto a tactic that would reshape aerial combat in the Pacific theater. This maneuver violated every principle taught in flight school. Instructors at training bases had warned against negative G-force flight due to potential engine failure, structural damage, and pilot incapacitation. The official stance was clear, but in actual combat, survival trumped theory. The pilots who survived their first encounters with Zeros learned that conventional tactics were getting them killed. Japanese aviators had refined their tactics through years of combat in China, understanding their Mitsubishi A6M's advantages. American pilots, on the other hand, were fighting according to peacetime training against an enemy who had long discarded the rules. The story of inverted flight tactics goes beyond standard military history. Between 1942 and 1944, a small group of fighter pilots discovered that the human body could endure stresses aviation medicine deemed impossible. They learned that their aircraft could perform maneuvers engineers said would cause structural failure. Most importantly, they proved that sometimes survival meant flying directly toward the threat instead of away from it. This wasn't the sanitized version of Pacific air combat found in official reports. It was brutal, desperate innovation born from necessity, where split-second decisions determined whether pilots returned to base or ended up on casualty lists. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero first entered combat in China in 1940. By the time the United States joined the war in December 1941, Japanese pilots had thousands of combat hours perfecting their tactics. The Zero's performance created a deadly problem for Allied pilots. Below 300 mph, the Zero could outturn nearly any fighter, making traditional dogfights a losing strategy. Early reports from the Philippines and Java told a grim story. American pilots tried boom and zoom tactics, diving on Zeros from altitude, firing and climbing away. But if the attack failed, the Zero could easily outturn them. By mid-1942, the Japanese kill ratio had reached 3-to-1 in some areas. American pilots were admitting that they couldn't win turning battles against the Zero. American fighters like the F-4F Wildcat, P-40 Warhawk, and P-38 Lightning had their own advantages: firepower, armor, and dive speed. But none could match the Zero's agility in turns. Pilots were instructed to use their aircraft's strengths, avoid turning fights, and maintain the energy advantage. But combat rarely followed the plan. What made the tactical situation worse was the skill of Japanese aviators, many of whom had years of combat experience. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, and formation tactics at a level American pilots were still learning. A common Japanese tactic involved one Zero acting as bait, appearing vulnerable. When an American pilot committed to the attack, 2 more Zeros would drop from above or slide in from the flanks. The moment a fighter became defensive, it was forced into a turning fight, which played directly into the Zero's strengths. The dynamics of turning combat are unforgiving. Turn radius depends on both velocity and G-force loading. The lightweight construction of the Zero, achieved by sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, gave it unparalleled turning capability. American fighters, however, carried armor plating behind the pilot seat, self-sealing tanks, and heavier armament. These features kept pilots alive when hit but added weight, which increased wing loading and expanded the turning radius. American pilots were essentially tasked with defeating an enemy who had the most critical advantage in dogfighting. While flying aircraft designed for survivability, not maneuverability, the maneuver that would eventually save countless American lives wasn't derived from textbooks or doctrine. It emerged from raw desperation and a serendipitous discovery. The split S, as it came to be called, involved rolling inverted and pulling through into a diving turn. Normally, pilots experience positive G-forces that push blood toward their feet, narrowing their vision. At around 5 to 6 Gs, many pilots experience a grey-out or blackout. But when a pilot rolls upside down and pulls the stick forward, they experience negative G-forces. Blood rushes to their head, causing a readout where their vision turns red as blood vessels in the eyes engorge. In 1942, aviation medicine suggested that humans could barely tolerate negative G-forces. Studies showed that even -2 Gs could cause severe discomfort, disorientation, and potential retinal damage. Official guidance recommended avoiding negative G flight entirely, but these studies were conducted in controlled settings with test pilots who weren't under fire. Combat created its own set of rules. A pilot enduring 2 seconds of readout vision but escaping a Zero's gun sight survived, whereas a pilot who stayed in positive G flight but remained in the Zero's crosshairs would not. The choice wasn't comfort versus discomfort. It was temporary blindness versus certain death. The physics behind why the inverted dive worked lay in energy management and predicting the opponent's actions. When a Zero pilot gained a tail position, they expected the target to either outturn them, impossible, or climb away, which drained the American aircraft's energy and made it easier to target. The inverted dive did neither. It converted altitude into speed in a vector the Zero pilot didn't anticipate. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot attempted to follow the maneuver, his aircraft would be stretched to its limits. The Zero could handle positive Gs up to about 7 Gs, but its lighter construction made negative G flight risky as it was not designed for sustained inverted flight. The P-38's twin Allison engines offered an advantage in negative G flight. Unlike single-engine fighters with carbureted engines, which could experience fuel starvation during inverted maneuvers, the P-38's fuel systems performed reliably under negative G loads. This was not by design, but became operationally significant. A P-38 pilot could maintain power through an inverted dive, while pursuing aircraft might experience momentary power loss, increasing the gap between them. The human body's tolerance for negative G-forces was higher than expected, provided the exposure was brief. Pilots reported that the readout effect lasted only a few seconds during a well-executed split S. The discomfort was intense, headaches, facial fatigue, bloodshot eyes, but survivable. Several pilots noted they'd rather endure a headache back at base than a proper burial at sea. The informal risk assessment was simple. Negative G maneuvers were painful. But Japanese cannons were more painful. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38 Lightnings from Port Moresby, New Guinea, was the first to deliberately use the inverted dive tactic on April 11, 1943. Lynch was leading a 4-plane patrol when they encountered 8 Zeros at 20,000 feet. Instead of engaging in a traditional horizontal fight, Lynch immediately rolled inverted as the lead Zero closed in. He pulled through into a steep dive, accelerating to over 400 mph, and leveled out at 8,000 feet. The Zero pilot, unable to match Lynch's speed and dive angle, pulled out at 12,000 feet. Lynch didn't just survive, he reversed the situation. After leveling out, he had both altitude and speed advantage, which he used to climb back up. He then attacked the now disorganized Japanese formation from below, shooting down 2 Zeros in the process. His wingman, following his example, also survived without losses. The after-action report noted the tactic but downplayed it. Official doctrine still discouraged negative G maneuvers. What made Lynch's action significant was that it was deliberate. Other pilots had rolled inverted instinctively, but Lynch had used the maneuver consciously and with purpose. At first, many pilots performed the inverted dive maneuver under duress, surviving by sheer luck. Major Thomas Lynch, however, recognized it as a repeatable technique. Within a week, he was teaching it to other pilots in his squadron during informal briefings. The instructions were simple. If a Zero gets on your tail and you can't shake him conventionally, roll inverted, pull through, dive hard, and use the speed to separate. Don't try to outturn him horizontally. Use the vertical dimension instead. The Zero excels in the horizontal circle, but American fighters dominate the vertical dive. By June 1943, the tactic had spread to other P-38 units operating out of Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots shared it during ready room discussions and squadron debriefings. It remained unofficial, not prohibited, but not endorsed by formal tactical directives either. Squadron leaders recognized its effectiveness, but hesitated to make it official. They feared that if a pilot were killed attempting the maneuver, questions would arise about who authorized teaching such a tactic, which contradicted established training. As a result, the tactic spread through word of mouth, with experienced pilots showing newcomers how to execute it without formally documenting it. The 475th Fighter Group, which arrived in the Southwest Pacific in August 1943, received informal briefings on the inverted dive tactic from veterans of the 49th Fighter Group. Major Charles MacDonald, who would later become one of the Pacific Theater's leading aces with 27 kills, credited the split-S maneuver with saving his life on at least 3 occasions. His combat reports from late 1943 reveal a clear pattern. Engage Zeros from altitude, make a high-speed pass, and if counter-attacked during the climb back up, roll inverted and dive away. Reset the engagement on more favorable terms. It wasn't elegant dogfighting. It was a brutal form of survival mathematics that occasionally led to victory. The physiological cost of negative G flight wasn't something any training manual had fully prepared pilots for. During a typical split-S maneuver, pilots experienced negative 2 to 3 Gs, causing blood pressure in the head to rise rapidly. Pilots reported intense pressure behind their eyes, followed by the readout effect, where their entire visual field turned crimson. The pressure resulted from blood vessels in the retina and conjunctiva engorging with blood, forced upward by negative acceleration. For 2 to 3 seconds, pilots were effectively flying blind, relying on their kinesthetic sense and instrument memory to control the aircraft. Flight surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in late 1943, documented the physical aftermath of these maneuvers. He examined dozens of pilots who regularly used the inverted dive tactic. Nearly all showed petechial hemorrhaging, small broken blood vessels around their eyes and forehead. Some had subconjunctival hemorrhages, leaving their eyes bloodshot for days. Severe headaches were common, and some pilots reported temporary vision problems or blurred sight that lasted for hours after landing. Moorhead's unofficial conclusion, never published in medical journals, was that the maneuvers caused measurable physical damage, but nothing permanently debilitating. The greater risk, however, was the moment of blindness itself. For those 2 to 3 seconds of readout, pilots couldn't see their altimeter, airspeed indicator, or attitude instruments. They couldn't see the enemy or the ground rushing up. The maneuver required total commitment. A pilot had to establish the dive angle, pull the negative Gs, and hold the control input until his vision cleared, trusting he had judged his altitude correctly before rolling inverted. Several fatal accidents occurred in training when pilots initiated the maneuver too low or held the dive too long. There was no margin for error at 5,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, there was more time to correct. The math of survival became clear. Never go inverted below 8,000 feet unless death was otherwise certain. Experienced pilots developed techniques to minimize the readout duration. Some learned to tense their neck and facial muscles to restrict blood flow to the head. Others discovered that if they rolled inverted but pulled less aggressively, trading maximum maneuver performance for slightly better vision, they could maintain partial sight throughout the maneuver. This became a judgment call. Maximum negative G input generated the fastest separation from a pursuing zero, but caused complete visual blackout. Moderate negative G input allowed some visual reference, but reduced the effectiveness of the escape. In practice, most chose maximum separation. Better to be blind for 3 seconds and alive than semi-aware and shot down. The psychological aspect was equally challenging. Human beings have strong instincts against actions that cause pain and sensory deprivation. Voluntarily inducing temporary blindness while someone is trying to kill you runs counter to every survival instinct. Yet pilots learn to override that instinct. The first time was terrifying. The second time was still frightening. By the 5th or 6th time, it became just another unpleasant part of combat flying, like flak, like fuel management, like watching friends die. The body adapted. The mind adapted. What once seemed impossible soon became another essential tool for survival. The inverted dive tactic spread throughout the Pacific theater like an underground movement, passed from squadron to squadron without ever appearing in official tactical publications. By September 1943, P-38 units in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were routinely teaching the maneuver to replacement pilots during their first week in-country. The training was informal, with veteran pilots pulling new arrivals aside after mess to explain what worked and what got pilots killed. Squadron commanders were aware of the practice. Some supported it openly, while others preferred to ignore it, maintaining plausible deniability if 5th Air Force Headquarters questioned the unauthorized training. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts out of Port Moresby, officially incorporated the Split S maneuver into his unit's tactics in October 1943. The P-47, heavier than the P-38, was at a disadvantage in turning combat with zeros, but it could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and its radial engine handled negative Gs reasonably well. Kirby's approach was pragmatic. He told his pilots that if they tried to turn with a zero, they'd die. But if they used the P-47's weight and power to control vertical engagements, diving attacks followed by inverted escapes, they would survive and win. On October 11, 1943, Kirby personally shot down 6 Japanese aircraft using these tactics and was awarded the Medal of Honor for that mission. In early 1944, Marine Corps F-4U Corsair squadrons adopted similar techniques. The Corsair had performance advantages over the Zero in most parameters, except turning radius. Marine pilots based on islands like Munda and Vela La Vela found the inverted dive even more effective in the Corsair than in twin-engine fighters. The F-4U's powerful Pratt and Whitney R2800 engine maintained thrust during negative G maneuvers, and its robust structure allowed pilots to pull out of dives at higher speeds without fear of wing failure. Major Robert Gaylor, teaching tactics to the Black Sheep Squadron, VMF 214, demonstrated the maneuver repeatedly, stressing that it was a defensive escape, not an offensive weapon. By mid-1944, the technique had reached Navy carrier squadrons operating in the Central Pacific. Pilots from carriers like the USS Essex and USS Lexington now included inverted maneuvers in their standard tactics. The terminology varied. Some called it a split S, others a negative G break, while some simply referred to it as rolling downward. Regardless of the name, the execution was the same. When conventional defensive maneuvers failed, invert and dive. The safety threshold remained at around 8,000 feet. Below that altitude, pilots were either forced to use other escape methods or accept that they were in a fight to the death. Not all aircraft types could safely perform the maneuver. Navy F-6F Hellcat pilots reported that their carbureted engines sometimes sputtered or quit during sustained inverted flight, though they usually restarted quickly. Army Air Force P-40 pilots found their aircraft structurally sound enough for the maneuver but lacked the dive performance needed to create sufficient separation from Zeros. These limitations made tactics aircraft-specific. A P-38 pilot could rely on the inverted dive as a primary defensive tool, while a P-40 pilot had to use different options. However, the underlying principle became universal across the theater. Vertical maneuvers, including inverted flight when necessary, beat horizontal turning fights every time. By late 1943, Japanese pilots had noticed the American inverted dive tactic and began attempting countermeasures. Initial reports from returning Zero pilots noted American fighters rolling inverted and diving away at high speed. The Japanese initially interpreted this as a retreat, believing American pilots were afraid of close combat. This misjudgment was strategically dangerous, as it reinforced Japanese tactical doctrine but missed the real threat. The inverted dive wasn't a retreat. It was a reset, allowing American pilots to choose when and how to re-engage on favorable terms. Some Japanese pilots attempted to follow American fighters through inverted dives, but the results were often disastrous. The Zero's lightweight construction, which gave it superior turning performance, became a liability in high-speed vertical maneuvers. The Zero's airframe could handle positive Gs, but its safety margin for negative Gs was much lower. Several Zero pilots who attempted to follow P-38s through aggressive inverted dives suffered control surface flutter or structural failure. Others experienced fuel delivery problems in their Nakajima Sakai engines during inverted flight, causing power loss at the worst possible moment, often mid-dive. A documented incident in December 1944 over Lady Gulf demonstrated the lethal nature of the tactic. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Maguire, flying a P-38, was engaged by 4 Zeros at 18,000 feet. When the lead Zero achieved a firing position, Maguire rolled inverted and dove, with the Japanese pilot attempting to follow. The inverted dive tactic spread through the Pacific theater like an underground method, passed from squadron to squadron without ever appearing in official tactical publications. By September 1943, P-38 units across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were teaching the maneuver to replacement pilots during their first week in country. The training was informal, with veteran pilots taking new arrivals aside after dinner to explain what worked and what got people killed. Squadron commanders were aware of the practice. Some encouraged it, while others chose to ignore it, maintaining plausible deniability in case 5th Air Force Headquarters questioned the unauthorized training. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts from Port Moresby, officially incorporated the Split S into his unit's tactics in October 1943. The P-47 was even heavier than the P-38, which made it poorly suited for turning combat against Zeros. But it could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and its radial engine handled negative Gs well. Kirby's strategy was clear. He told his pilots that if they tried to turn with a Zero, they'd die. But if they used the P-47's weight and power to control vertical engagements, diving attacks followed by inverted escapes, they would survive and win. Kirby personally shot down 6 Japanese aircraft on October 11, 1943, using these tactics, and was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. Marine Corps F-4U. Corsair squadrons adopted similar techniques in early 1944. The Corsair had performance advantages over the Zero in most areas except turning radius. Marine pilots operating from island bases like Munda and Vella La Vella found that the inverted dive worked even better in the Corsair than in twin-engine fighters. The F-4U's Pratt & Whitney RT-800 engine maintained thrust during negative G maneuvers, and its structural strength meant pilots could pull out of dives at higher speeds without worrying about wing failure. Major Robert Gaylor, teaching tactics to VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, demonstrated the maneuver repeatedly. emphasizing that it was a defensive tactic, not an offensive one. By mid-1944, the inverted dive tactic had reached Navy carrier squadrons operating in the Central Pacific. Pilots flying from carriers like the USS Essex and USS Lexington were now briefed on inverted maneuvers as part of standard tactics. The terminology varied. Some called it the split S, others referred to it as a negative G break, while some simply described it as rolling downward. The execution, however, was consistent. When conventional defensive maneuvers failed, pilots were instructed to invert and dive. The safety threshold remained around 8,000 feet. Below that altitude, pilots were left with few escape options or were forced to fight to the death. Not all aircraft could safely perform the maneuver. Navy F-6F Hellcat pilots reported their carbureted engines sometimes sputtered or shut down during sustained inverted flight, though they usually restarted quickly. Army Air Force P-40 pilots found their aircraft structurally capable of the maneuver, but lacked the necessary dive performance to create sufficient separation from Zeros. As a result, the tactic was aircraft-specific. P-38 pilots could rely on the inverted dive as a primary defense tool, while P-40 pilots needed different escape strategies. Nevertheless, the core principle became universal. Vertical maneuvers, including inverted flight when necessary, consistently trumped horizontal turning fights. By late 1943, Japanese pilots had begun recognizing the inverted dive tactic and attempted countermeasures. Combat reports from returning Zero pilots mentioned American fighters rolling inverted and diving away at high speed. The Japanese initially interpreted this as a retreat, believing American pilots were avoiding close combat. This interpretation proved dangerously flawed, as it missed the real threat. The inverted dive wasn't a retreat, it was a reset, allowing American pilots to re-engage on their own terms. Some Japanese pilots tried to follow American fighters through inverted dives, but the results were often disastrous. The Zero's lightweight design, which gave it superior turning ability, became a liability in high-speed vertical maneuvers. The Zero could handle positive Gs but was less capable in negative G flight. Several Japanese pilots who tried to follow P-38s through aggressive inverted dives suffered control surface flutter or structural failure. Others experienced fuel problems with their Nakajima engines, causing power loss during the dive and leading to failure in the most critical moment. One documented incident from December 1944 over Lady Gulf illustrated the effectiveness of the tactic. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Maguire, flying a P-38, was engaged by 4 Zeros at 18,000 feet. When the lead Zero got into firing position, Maguire rolled inverted and dove. The Japanese pilot followed, trying to keep Maguire in his sights. However, Maguire's P-38 accelerated past 450 mph in the dive, while the pursuing Zero began experiencing severe vibrations at around 380 mph. The Japanese pilot had no choice but to pull out early or risk structural failure. Maguire leveled off at 6,000 feet, gained the energy advantage, and shot down 2 of the 4 Zeros. The remaining 2 disengaged. By late 1944, the fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that the Zero, which had once been the most effective aircraft in the theater, was now optimized for the wrong type of combat. Early in the war, when engagements took place at medium altitudes and involved prolonged turning fights, the Zero's characteristics were perfect. However, as American tactics evolved toward high-speed slashing attacks and vertical maneuvers, the Zero's advantages became irrelevant, and its vulnerabilities, including lack of armor, a lightweight structure, and slower dive speeds, became critical weaknesses. Japanese aircraft designers recognized this issue. Later variants of the Zero and newer designs like the J-2M Raiden improved dive performance and structural strength. But these improvements arrived too late and in limited numbers to shift the tactical balance. By 1944, Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than they could replace them. New pilots received minimal training, focusing mainly on basic flight skills and traditional dogfighting tactics. There was little time or fuel for advanced energy management or vertical combat techniques. Meanwhile, American training programs had evolved, incorporating lessons learned from combat veterans. By late 1944, replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific were already familiar with inverted dive tactics before their first combat missions. The knowledge gap had reversed. Japanese pilots, once the most experienced in the theater, were now often the least prepared for the war's actual tactical environment. The inverted dive tactics, developed between 1943 and 1945, didn't disappear after World War II ended. They became embedded in fighter combat doctrine, although without acknowledgement of the desperate innovations made by P-38 and Corsair pilots fighting for survival. Modern fighter combat training at institutions like the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, includes negative G maneuvers as standard defensive tactics. While terminology has evolved, with terms like negative G pushover or unloaded roll, the fundamental principles and physics remain the same. The Korean War saw American pilots using similar tactics against the MiG-15, which had excellent high-altitude performance and could outturn most American aircraft in horizontal combat. F-86 Sabre pilots, facing similar problems to P-38 pilots against Zeros, used vertical maneuvers and negative G escapes when MiGs gained the advantage. Captain Joseph McConnell, the top American ace of the Korean War with 16 kills, credited his survival to what he called rolling out beneath pursuing MiGs, the same inverted dive concept, now applied to jet combat at 40,000 feet and 600 map. In the Vietnam War, fighter pilots rediscovered these lessons. Early in the conflict, American pilots, trained primarily for beyond visual range missile combat, found themselves in close-range dogfights against nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The initial results were poor. The establishment of Top Gun in 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar formally recognized that dogfighting skills, including negative G defensive maneuvers, were still crucial despite technological advancements. Instructors at Top Gun taught tactics that veterans of the Pacific War would have recognized. Immediately, use your aircraft's strengths, avoid the enemy's advantages, and when defensive, go vertical and inverted if necessary. Modern fighter aircraft like the F-16, F-18 and F-35 are designed to handle negative G flight with fuel systems, engine designs, and structural strength built to avoid the limitations faced by World War II aircraft. Pilots today train in centrifuges to build tolerance for both positive and negative G-forces. The redoubt effect that once terrified pilots in 1943 is now a manageable phenomenon. However, the underlying principle hasn't changed. Negative G flight allows pilots to perform maneuvers their opponents don't expect, creating separation and opportunities for counterattacks. What makes the Pacific War innovation remarkable is that it happened entirely outside official channels, with no aeronautical engineer designing the tactic or tactical development board approving it. It spread through the warrior network, experienced pilots teaching survival skills to new arrivals. The men who developed these tactics never received formal recognition, but their improvisations continue to shape fighter combat doctrine today. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, survived because he mastered vertical combat and wasn't afraid to go inverted when necessary. Thomas Lynch, the first to intentionally use the tactic, was killed in action in March 1944, not because his tactics failed, but because combat flying was inherently lethal. Their legacy lives on in modern fighter pilots, who still train to roll inverted and use negative G flight when defensive, a direct lineage from desperate innovations made in cockpits over the Pacific, where survival required rewriting the rules mid-flight.